Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Our esteemed viewers, on behalf of His Excellency Dr. Sultan Mohammed Al-Naimi, Director General of the Emirates Center for Strategic Studies and Research, we would like to welcome you to a symposium titled President-elect Joe Biden and the Future of U.S. Foreign Policy in the Middle East. These discussions will be in the form of Q&A sessions, so we would like to take this opportunity to thank our followers on social media for their participation in submitting questions for us to ask our panelists. I'm delighted to welcome our guests on this first panel titled Interpreting the Results of the U.S. Presidential Election. We have with us today Dr. William Galston, who is the Ezra Zilka Chair in Governance Studies and a Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution. He is a public policy expert and has advised on 6 presidential campaigns. Welcome to you, sir.
Pleasure.
Also with us today, Dr. Al-Badr Al-Shatri, who is an Emirati academic and former professor at the National Defense College of the UAE. Dr. Al-Shatri, thank you for being with us today.
Well, thank you for having me.
Gentlemen, let's get started with our first question, which focuses on the domestic situation regarding the workings of the U.S. government. Now, Dr. Galston, President Trump's handling of government agencies created a degree of uncertainty, which undermined morale and expertise within government departments. Will the actions of the Trump administration have long-term consequences for the functioning of the government, or are these agencies resilient enough to move beyond these issues?
Well, it's a good thing that the first question is the easiest, which will give me time to wake up this morning. I believe, based on historical experience, that our executive institutions are resilient enough to withstand the many blows that have been administered during the past 4 years. It is certainly true that many talented people have been driven out of government. Some have been fired. Others have resigned in protest. The morale in many departments and agencies is low. The attacks on the State Department, on the Defense Department, on our intelligence services, and many others have been very discouraging to people who have given their lives to government service and have faithfully served presidents of both political parties for decades. And they feel a deep sense of injustice at the way that they have been treated. On the other hand, these people are dedicated public servants, and I can assure you that there are many, many people who will be willing to fill the offices that have been vacated during the past 4 years. There will be a period of rebuilding, but after that period of rebuilding, I believe that the American government will be functioning normally. That is to say, the way it did before the wrecking ball hit the building during the past 4 years.
Thank you, Doctor. And Dr. Al-Shatri, I mean, having observed this from a Middle East perspective, perhaps, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, actually, I agree with the doctor and everything he said, but I will add a couple of things. Now we are witnessing what is going to happen to Trumpism. Is it going to be fleeting like the moral majority, the Tea Party, which proves to be a tempest in the teapot, or is going to be lingering, for quite some time? But I think what happened in storming the Congress, and I think Americans don't like the word storming because it is evocative of storming the Bastille. And Americans don't consider their Congress to be the Bastille and those mobs to be revolutionaries like the French in 1789. So whatever the word you're going to choose for those mobs who invaded and for a while controlled the Congress, it betrays more deep structural crisis within the American system. The late political scientist Samuel Huntington used to say there is a conflict always between United States was based on ideals of individualism, of constitutionalism, of democracy, And those ideals clash with established institutions. Why? Because institutions are the holders of power. This is where the locus of power. And liberty does not want to be encumbered by those institutions. So usually you have this institutional and ideal gap, which endangers or produces what he calls creedal passions. And those creedal passions appear in American history in 60 years intervals. So he was talking about, for example, the 60s, and as you know, Huntington passed in 2005, I believe. And he said he predicts in his book, American Politics, The Promise of Disharmony, that in 2020, there will be something big, disturbances to renew those democracy. So for those people who were storming those institutions, they weren't, from their point of view and perspective, they weren't breaking the law. They were reclaiming their liberty against those powerful institutions. So our liberty is against politicians who are holding power. So this is what explains the outbursts. By the way, I'm not justifying unlawful, obviously an unlawful act, but that's how they feel. They feel they've been marginalized by globalization. They feel that their country was stolen by immigrants, by non-whites who founded the country state, and therefore they are reclaiming their country. So, but American democracy will be tested, and their institution will be tested, how much it can adapt to the new situation, right? So if these things happen in other countries, you might see a total collapse. But the US institutions are durable, but how much they are adaptive, which is very important, will remain to be seen. By the way, just to add one point, if you remember Francis Fukuyama was talking about the decaying of American institution. And why? Because American institution was grabbed or captured by a special interest, which doesn't give it autonomy to play the role it's supposed to play. So actually it becomes subservient to a specific and narrow interest. And this is the crisis, and it needs to renew itself every because institutions, he says, are created for a specific historical context and need to adapt to different changing circumstances.
I'll go on to the second question for now. The US presidential election took place against the backdrop of a highly polarized society. How would you characterize the 2020 electoral landscape when compared to the 2016 elections?
The first thing to observe about the 2020 election is the extraordinarily high level of political mobilization. The turnout for the presidential election was the highest in more than 100 years. And both political parties were deeply committed to turn out for the election. And the numbers exceeded even the highest expectations. And what that indicates is that political passions are very high on both sides, and the country is divided. I think what we saw in 2020 was not a change of direction, but rather an intensification of trends that had been clearly observable 4 years ago and even before that. The shift of support in the Democratic Party even more towards the large cities and the environs surrounding the large cities. The shift of Republican support to the small towns and more rural areas. The shift of more educated Americans to the Democrats and less educated to the Republicans. The division between professionals who work with words and numbers and people who work with their hands. I could go on and on and on. That said, the electoral map in 2020 was not very different from the electoral map in 2016. The states that Joe Biden took away from Donald Trump, the 5 states, were all states that were closely contested in 2016. It's not as though a dedicated Trump state suddenly flipped on its head and became a Biden state. Not at all. The three Midwestern states of Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania were all decided by very narrow margins in both 2016 and 2020. And Georgia and Arizona, which flipped to the Democrats for the first time in a long time, were also among the states that Mr. Trump carried by the narrowest of margins in 2016, more than the upper Midwestern states, but still quite narrow. So what Joe Biden did was to add about 3.5% of popular support to Hillary Clinton's total. Donald Trump actually got a higher share of the popular vote in 2020 than he did in 2016. And you can explain that by the fact that minor parties and independent candidacies, which had gotten 6% of the vote in 2016, got less than 2% in 2020. So it was really a contest between the two major parties. So in sum, I would say that the big surprise of 2020 was the size of the electoral turnout. But as for the fundamental underlying geographic and demographic trends, it was an intensification and not a change of direction.
Right. Now, gentlemen, although the Democrats now, they control both chambers of Congress, the Senate and the House of Representatives, their majority has been reduced. Following the presidential elections, how will a highly polarized American political landscape shape the dynamic between Joe Biden and Congress, particularly on domestic and foreign policy? Dr. Golson, if you'd like to go ahead.
The premise of your question is certainly correct. In the House of Representatives, which is the lower chamber of our Congress, the Democrats have the smallest majority since the 1940s. In the Senate, which has 100 members, the division is exactly even, 50-50. And the tie is broken by the Vice President of the United States, who is, of course, a Democrat, as Joe Biden is. So technically speaking, the Democrats have the majority in the Senate. Functionally speaking, it will be much more complicated than that. Because if there's an exact tie, then any single Democratic senator who dissents from the leadership can prevent legislation from going forward. Now, what are the consequences of this? They are not necessarily what you would expect, where you have a free-for-all, every man and every woman for himself or herself. I am part of an organization that has been involved in creating a so-called center bloc in the Senate and also in the House of Representatives, made up of groups of members from both political parties who are determined to drive the system away from gridlock and towards compromise between the two political parties. As the result of the 2020 elections, these two center blocs now hold the pivotal votes in both the House and the Senate. And if they can agree on compromise legislation, then it is certainly possible that both the president and the leadership of both political parties will be driven to accept that. And we saw an example of that in December, where the gridlock over additional aid to the unemployed and small businesses and others was broken by a proposal from this center bloc. So there will be a struggle in 2021 between the forces of gridlock and the forces of compromise. But neither political party can impose its will on the other. That is the fundamental fact for at least the next 2 years.
Thank you. And Dr. Badr, I mean, do you see this impact of polarization impacting his attempts, being Joe Biden's attempts to address the pandemic, the COVID pandemic?
Well, actually, Biden will come with a full plate. He has to address not only the pandemic, but the economic woes. He has to address what is called structural racism in American society because of Black Lives Matters and so on. And so he has a lot of issues. So it depends on issue by issue, as Dr. Goldstone said. For example, he will get his nominees for the cabinet and sub-cabinet, I think, quite quickly through the Senate, because there is the control of the Democrats of the Senate, and he only needs the Senate to confirm his nominees for the cabinet and the sub-cabinet positions. There will be some legislations that will be as the previous speaker said, will be more controversial, and you might have some defection from the Democrats, or vice versa. You might have Republicans defecting to the Democrats. But overall, I think we are not going to see a gridlock till the midterm elections. Now, in the midterm elections, usually the incumbent party loses either house or both houses, as it happened, several times, as it happened to Mr. Trump, when in 2018 he lost the House, and this is quite expected in the midterm, but not necessarily. I mean, it's not inevitable that they will lose. I mean, it could even they make some gains. Depends on Biden's performance on those issues that are of utmost importance. But the country will remain divided. And there's another issue maybe we should address, although you didn't ask, is the Supreme Court. Now, the Supreme Court is controlled 6-3 in favor of the conservatives. You remember Trump appointed 3 judges to the Supreme Court. Now, there is rumors that the Democrats or Biden might want to broaden and add members to the Supreme Court. So if he adds like 3 new judges to bring some balance, because it's very important, a legislation can pass through both houses and can be knocked off from the Supreme Court, like when it happened in the Obamacare. In this case, the Supreme Court upheld that it could be that they might knock off that legislation or block that legislation as unconstitutional. So I think the Democrats will think very hard about the Supreme Court and how to rectify the imbalances created by the previous administration.
Okay, Dr. Bedr, I'd like to stick with you for this next question. So as you know, Biden's national security appointees largely hail from Obama's administration. Is this a sign that Biden's foreign policy will reflect that of Obama, or will recent developments, especially in the Middle East, see him take a different approach?
For sure, this is a democratic precedent, and it will be a comparable, and there will be some commonality between the Obama foreign policy and Biden. In fact, I would say there might be some commonality between Biden and previous Republican administration. But there is this myth about a vice president necessarily will follow his president's foreign policy. For example, we haven't seen this in different administrations. LBJ, the Lyndon Johnson, who succeeded Kennedy after the assassination, he charted his own domestic and foreign policy. George Bush 41 did the same, and I believe that Biden will not be any different. He's his own man. And by the way, Biden expertise in foreign policy is far superior to Obama. The guy was running the foreign relation, and he was always interested, and that's his strong suit, is the foreign relation. The only problem is with Biden, I think he has his plate too full in the domestic issues, that he might not have time to do much in the international arena, because he has to address a very serious problem within the United States. Other than that, I think I don't believe. Secondly, by the way, the appointments are not true. They come from Obama administration, but they are counted as Biden's people. For example, Tony Blinken, who's nominated for secretary. He was with Biden, before Obama was elected to the presidency. Jake Sullivan was with Hillary Clinton. He wasn't. He was brought to Obama because of Hillary Clinton, not because of Obama. The defense secretary, the nominee, Lloyd, he's a professional military who used to be the commander of the CENTCAM, and a person who's very familiar with our region, because he was running the Central Command of the American forces. So he knows this region. But by the way, he doesn't come from, Obama administration, or he is, politically inclined either way. Simply, he's a professional military. So I don't expect those who are nominated. Of course, there'll be, this is one country, right? And there is some consistency in different administration, and this will be one of them. But I think he'll be his own man.
And Dr. Galston, do you have anything to add in terms of Biden's appointees, perhaps, and what do you see as perhaps his key priorities in the Middle East, maybe?
The Greek philosopher Heraclitus famously said that you cannot step into the same river twice. And I do not believe that Joe Biden could simply recreate Barack Obama's foreign policy, even if he wanted to. Much has changed in the past 4 years. Some of these changes are irreversible, as your country knows very well. And so I think that that Joe Biden is a realist. The people whom he has selected to serve in defense and foreign policy positions are experienced. They are realists. They are not ideologues. They have goals, but they will adjust the execution of those goals to changed circumstances. So just to pick the most obvious example, over the past year, there has been a rapprochement, between a number of Arab and Muslim countries and the state of Israel. That will obviously continue. Will it expand? Who knows? Right? But it will continue. It will not be destabilized. Now, the most difficult issue revolves around a country that nobody has yet mentioned in this conversation, namely Iran. Will President Biden rejoin, the JCPOA as it was written and signed in the Obama administration? That is going to be a very difficult question. Very difficult question and a tough decision. If you listen to the campaign rhetoric, you might imagine that the new administration would rejoin and then subsequently seek negotiations on other contested issues having to do with missiles, support for Hezbollah and other organizations like that. I am not so sure that it's going to proceed that way. It is possible that the new administration will say that rejoining the pact depends on prior negotiations on issues that were not included in that pact 5 years ago. That is, it seems to me, the most fundamental decision that the new Biden administration will have to make in the next, say, 6 months. And much will flow from that decision, either way, as you know better than I do.
Thank you, Dr. Galston. Indeed, the Iranian issue, that'll be further explored in the upcoming panel discussions following this one by my fellow moderators. So we're going to definitely explore that. I'm going to leave you guys with actually ask you guys one more question, a last question, before we wrap up. In terms of, so obviously Biden has stated his intention to form a diverse administration, bringing together a variety of experience and perspectives. But how will he do this while also balancing the different interests within his own party, as well as working effectively with Republicans? Dr. Galston, you can go ahead for this one.
Well, you have used the key word in your question, and that word is balancing, right? The new president will be like what we call a tightrope walker in a circus, walking on a very thin wire high above the crowd without a net to catch him. And this will call upon all of the political skills that he has accumulated in nearly half a century of national public life. He was elected a U.S. Senator 48 years ago, and he has been in public life ever since. And based my observation so far is that he has constructed an administration that is designed to test the willingness of the other political party to engage in more cooperative behavior than we have seen for many years. Biden has staked his political career for decades on the proposition that there are reasonable people in both political parties and they can reach reasonable agreements. And so the administration that he has put together makes certain gestures in the direction of the more left-wing portion of the Democratic Party. But the center of gravity of the new administration is clearly elsewhere. Biden is making a big political bet that because of his experience, his knowledge of the key players on the other side, his willingness, his demonstrated willingness to compromise, his refusal to demonize his opponents, that all of that will create a new atmosphere for legislative progress. If he is right about that, he will be an extremely effective president. If he's wrong about that, then he will have to change his strategy entirely and perhaps recalibrate his administration with some new appointments.
And Dr. Badr, do you have anything to add to this in terms of when we mentioned Biden forming a more diverse administration, in, bringing together a lot of diversity, a variety of different experiences, people from different backgrounds, and so on?
Yeah, actually, he delivered on that promise. He brought many minorities into, in terms of gender, in terms of race, in terms of even sexual orientation, in many ways, by the way, it's very diverse, no question about that. But I think one thing we have to emphasize that his whole background, Biden's background, is from the legislative branch of government. He's been there for over 30 years in the Senate. So, he knows how to build coalition, how to reach out to the other side. And he's a truly, a political man. So I think he might have, unless if the other side want to undermine him completely as to prevent a second term, Biden or Kamala Harris, whoever will be running. So if that's their agenda, then there is no way he can compromise with such attitude. But if they want governance, and I think the United States today needs people to compromise because of the challenges it's facing within and without the United States. But if I can comment, and I agree with on the foreign policy issue, although the rhetoric might be realist on the part of Biden, but I think he will go back to what is called liberal internationalism. I think Biden will try to pursue multilateralism, rule-based international relation, and so on and so forth. He will, restore the international institution to a center place to play a role in without losing U.S. primacy in the world.
Dr. William Galston, Dr. Al-Badr al-Shatri, it's been a privilege speaking to you both today. Gentlemen, thank you very much for your insights, and this brings us to the end. So now I would like to hand over to my colleague, Mr. Abdullah Al-Ka'bi, who will be moderating the second discussion. So thank you very much, gentlemen, and goodbye. Thank you.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Ladies and gentlemen, we welcome you in our second session. The topic of this session is potential shifts in U.S. foreign policy and consequences for the Middle East. We have three distinguished speakers come from three different countries. The first speaker is Dr. Abdul Khaliq Abdullah. He is a professor of political science from the United Arab Emirates. The second speaker is Dr. Abdul Mun'im Saeed Ali. He is the chairman of the board and CEO of Al-Masri Al-Yawm, which is the Egyptian Today publishing house in Cairo. Our third speaker will be Mr. William Wessler. He is the director of Rafiq Al-Hariri Center and Middle East programs at the Atlantic Council in Washington, D.C. Gentlemen, we welcome you again to our discussion. Now we will start with the first question, and it is going to be to Dr. Abdul Khaliq Abdullah. Currently, the United States and Gulf states enjoy a strong alliance with a mutual determination to strengthen these relationships. However, there has been discussion in the US over the need to reconsider ties. Do you, Dr. Abdul Khaliq, believe that Biden will confirm things, potential change in direction? And if so, which approach would he take? Is he more likely to continue giving precedence to American national interest in maintaining these relationships?
Thank you, Abdullah, for having me, and good evening or good morning to the panelists in this session. I think this question takes us to a bigger issue of change versus continuity in American approach to Middle East. This issue of change, continuity comes up every time there is a new president, every time there is a new administration, every time there is a new team in DC and in the White House. So this issue is a very important issue. How much is continuity? How much is change are we to expect? With regard to the Arab Gulf states, I'll take my cue from what we heard from Blinken, the designated Secretary of State, who said in a couple of interviews that he had lately. Once in one of these interviews, he said that America is stronger, working with allies, working with partners, working with friends throughout the world, including the Middle East and the Gulf. And if that is the case, then I expect that the United States, the new administration, would value that there is a friend, a reliable friend, a trusted friend in the Gulf. And these Arab Gulf states have been across the board, probably the most reliable of friends that America had in this region, plus Israel, of course. And I think if that is the case, then I expect that he will deliver on this statement. We are stronger together. The United States is stronger working with the Arab Gulf states, and Arab Gulf states will feel comfortable and stronger working with the upcoming administration. However, he also said in one of those interviews, which is a contradiction of a sort, he said that we would be doing less, not more, in Middle East. And he comes across as kind of negating the first stand, which is a bit confusing to us. Are they going to do less when it comes to Middle East, including the Arab Gulf states, which means that America would probably retreat, withdraw, or lessen its involvement? That is a statement of a concern to us. Whatever the case, I think the Arab Gulf states have proven to be a reliable force. We have worked with all presidents very successfully, some 14 presidents over the past 70 years in the duration of our relationship. The Middle East is a burden to America, but the Arab Gulf states are an asset. So I would expect that there will be maybe a change in style, maybe a change of narrative, but the substance will stay the same, Abdullah.
Okay. Mr. William or Dr. Abdul Man'am, do you want to add any comments or make comments here?
I think that we have to start from a point that tell us, what kind of a president that Joe Biden will come to our region. On the other hand, what kind of a region the Middle East will be in facing Biden. And I will say that Biden is different completely from Trump. That's obvious. And he is a very highly institutionalized president. And he is many ways representing a current in American foreign policy that started withdrawing from the Middle East since the second George Bush term, and then enhanced during Obama and more on Trump time. Now I think Biden will keep that, because we have to know, the number of priorities he set by himself, that he has domestic over foreign. In domestic he has Corona, he has the unity of the American people, and in foreign he said it quite well that his priority is the Western alliance, management of competition with China and Russia, and then the rest of everything in the world, in which the Middle East is included very way down in the list of priorities. I believe also that Biden is coming to the region or to the world, for that matter, very humbled with the experience of the 6th of January in Washington, and probably more empathetic with the Middle East that he is facing, because he is eye to eye with rising right-wing fanatic, conspiracy, tilted audience. 75 million voted for a president who doesn't show up his taxes, who is groping women, and who is doing a lot of things that's, in connection with a major rival to the United States, which is Russia. And these guys are old enough, well-educated enough, knowledgeable enough, yet they voted for Mr. Trump. So he is coming to us, and Mr. Trump and the right wing is there to stay. The Middle East itself is different from what it was. I think we have 10 years of very unmerciful time for the Middle East, starting with Arab Spring, starting with how regional powers used the time in the Middle East to, particularly Iran, Turkey, Israel, Ethiopia. Each one of them tried to get geostrategic gains, and domestically in the Middle East, the rise of Islamist politics, radical. The first time we got in the contemporary history, a new caliphate in the region. But yet, that region, now, 10 years later, is quite getting different in many respects. One of them is that the region is, by the end of this decade and the beginning of the new decade, is really overcoming a lot of difficulties that it was faced. There is a very strong reform trend in the region, in countries like Saudi Arabia, Egypt, UAE, Kuwait, Tunisia, Morocco, Jordan, and also there is a containment of violence in the region. I mean, that's probably will give him some opportunities in the region, because not only violence is contained even in Syria, it is only now in the northeast, and Libya is stabilizing day by day. Sudan and Iraq are starting their own reforms. And I can give more details later, but I want to say that there are positive things in the Middle East that got to be noticed. Particularly the end is that in the region there is a strong peace and cooperative movement, whether led by Egypt in the Eastern Mediterranean or led by the UAE in the Gulf Israeli relation that opened, the road for a new. Even now, today in Cairo, there is a meeting with Germany and France and Egypt and Jordan to talk about how to resume diplomatic peace process. So there is a lot in the Middle East, but the priorities of Biden is very low. And I will say, outside the issue of Iran and its nuclear issue, there are the normal things: opportunities, diplomatic relations, economic opportunities that come up in the Gulf or in the region. I don't see a strong American influence coming to the region, except with the issue of the Iranian nuclear issue, because it is basically nuclear, and it's opening in the region also to a nuclear race with Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE to get into the competition. So that's where we are now, between the two new sides in this equation.
Thank you. What about you, Mr. William? Do you want to add anything?
Just a few things to add to the very smart and comments that have been made so far. The first thing that I would point out is Joe Biden will be the 5th consecutive president in a row who campaigned for office saying they wanted to do less in the Middle East than their predecessor had done. There are a lot of reasons for that politically in the United States, but it's also notable to look back on history and say that's 2 of his predecessors, Clinton and George W. Bush, actually ended up reversing their campaign pledges and doing more in the Middle East than they intended. The last 2, Obama and Trump, stayed by those campaign promises. So while the overall, I won't disagree with my colleagues here, and the overall drive in the United States is to do less in the region, the most important factor that is affecting the region, I would argue, is the widespread perception of imminent American withdrawal, despite the fact that from historical levels, the amount of military forces, the amount of diplomatic activity, the amount of economic activity, the amount of intelligence have not changed, have not declined, and in some places have gone up. They've only declined in comparison to when we were occupying a country. So and the other thing, as has been noted before, is that Joe Biden comes into office far more experienced in international affairs and far more experienced with the Middle East than the vast majority of his predecessors. He is at heart, as was mentioned, an institutionalist. He is at heart someone who understands U.S. interests very well. He is an internationalist. He looks for allies and partners, and he depends a lot on his personal relationships with the leaders, some of which go back decades. So there are arguments on one side or the other to look at about whether or not Joe Biden is going to do more in the Middle East, do less in the Middle East. Of course, the domestic concerns, as has been mentioned, will weigh very heavily, especially at the outset. But I do think at the end of the day, what it will come down to is decisions made by the governments in the region about how they will engage with President Biden. And a certain number of those governments are already tacking and have been for some time to hedge against the possibility of Trump's loss. I think the UAE's departure, drawdown in Yemen has been a positive sign. I think Saudi Arabia and Qatar's rapprochement has been a positive sign. I think certainly the relationships between that have been built between the several Gulf states and Israel are a very positive sign and position the region well with an incoming Biden administration. But there will be more issues. There will be serious issues between the Biden administration and Saudi Arabia. There will be significant issues between the Biden administration and Turkey. And there will be a significantly different approach to the nuclear file with Iran. The governments in the region will need to decide whether or not they are going to try to constructively work with the Biden administration on many of these issues that differ from the Trump administration, or whether they are going to try to forcefully and overtly oppose the Biden administration. And I think that will, more than anything else, define what the nature of the U.S. relationship is in the region.
Mr. Whistler, we would like to hear from you more about the relationship and the special relationship between the region and the United States. There is a debate in the American political circles, especially within the Republican and Democrat parties, over reconsidering the United States' commitment to the region's security. Do you believe Biden will reduce the U.S. military presence in the region, particularly after choosing Lloyd Austin as the defense secretary, who surprised the withdrawals of U.S. troops from Iraq in cooperation with Biden? Or will he maintain current troops level and promote alliance across the region aimed at growing mutual threats?
Yeah, I think that the overall troop levels will be looked at. There's no question about it. But I think if you listen to Joe Biden on the campaign trail, he was very careful to differentiate himself from other candidates in the Democratic Party who called for withdrawals of U.S. bases from the region entirely. It's not something that he said. He also talked about the need to be continuing to do some special operations work. He was very clear about that. He also, and it's important to notice, never, unlike Donald Trump, he never called into question the critical mission that our U.S. military plays in the region, which is to secure the freedom of navigation for energy resources, especially throughout the region and two markets in the world. President Trump, even at the height of his success in the Middle East, the moment when he was announcing the first part of the Abraham Accords between Israel and the UAE from the Oval Office, he couldn't help but to go off script and to wonder aloud why the United States should be in the business at all of protecting energy resources on the maritime domain. That, I suspect, is not something that you're going to hear from President Biden.
The third question is to Dr. Abdul Mun'im. Regarding the Trump administration's approach to the Palestinian issue, it has represented a radical shift in U.S. foreign policy, particularly on the status of Jerusalem, disputed settlements, and the Golan Heights. And more importantly, Trump cut aid to the Palestinians. However, Biden has expressed a desire to resume ties and aid to the Palestinians. So what can the incoming administration do to revive the peace process? And Dr. Abdul Mun'im, to what extent can it pressure Israel to stop annexing settlements and further engage in the peace process?
Biden, when we say that he is very minimalist on the Middle East part of his foreign policy posture, and he is going somewhere else, that doesn't mean a complete disconnection with the region. Obviously, as he said during the campaign, that he supports the Abraham Accord, which it's equation, which means normalization, peace for postponement or stopping the annexation of the settlements. The issue of Jerusalem, of course, he is very, approving of it. So he will be, in general, trying to soothe the situation better for things are done in the region already, which I am a believer. That's my opinion. That's something else that, it's time that the region take over the peace process. But now he will have a number of things that soften the situation by, for instance, resuming aid to the Palestinian Authority. By also trying to push other and mobilize other resources, particularly the Europeans, to get into the stage of negotiating a settlement that includes the Palestinians. I guess he will be willing to do things related to Jerusalem, particularly taking the issue of being open for all religions and people and others, to give more room to the Palestinians to be active in Jerusalem. Some ideas might come up to make a kind of a civic council to Jerusalem that include the population of Jerusalem, to run, the roads and the stop signs and water and electricity and things like that. And a number of ideas like this will find encouragement from Biden. They don't make necessarily a collision with either side. It will take the thorn, the Palestinian thorn out of the negotiations. But he understands very well that all those who made new postures toward Israel, it's because of geostrategic and geopolitical concerns. I mean, Iran is a matter on the Emirates and Bahrain side. the Sahara on the Moroccan side, the terrorism issue on the Sudanese side, which is understandable. And the Palestinians are, now it is how to get them into a number of issues, like they are now on the East Mediterranean Forum with Israel as equal partner in that kind of an organization. I assume we can extend that also to the north of the Red Sea. I mean, that's a kind of a new diplomacy in the region, that it came because of the delineation of maritime boundaries between countries in the Red Sea and the Mediterranean. And I think that will make another opening to a kind of, by the way, the UAE is now an observer in the Eastern Mediterranean Forum, and the Red Sea between Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Israel, Jordan, and Palestine. That will make a kind of mitigation to the whole tension of the Palestinian-Israeli confrontation that happened because of the settlement and without realizing that there are one common currency, there are exchanges related to taxes and labor, Palestinian labor in Israel, and the security cooperation between the two sides. The point I'm making is that there are something that is now formulated in the region, exactly like Sadat did it before, the Emirates did it now, and other consequences are falling from the region. This one deserves an American support. To what extent, we don't know yet. I mean, Biden but he is minimalist. He is not going, his major problem, how to get out of Afghanistan, how to get out of Iraq, how the Gulf, he cannot get out, so he has to manage his military force in the waters of the Gulf in order to get Iran back to the negotiating table, in order to get a new agreement that take care of what kind of developments that took place. So here, back to your question, there is the Palestinian issue will take its place in the overall strategic situation in the Middle East that involve other issues. The Palestinians will get a window. Are they going to use it, or Hamas will sabotage it? But not really anyone will be just waiting for them.
Thank you. Dr. Abdul Khaliq, do you want to add any comments regarding the peace process or the Palestinian issue?
Yeah, I'd like to maybe just make a quick comment on both interventions by Mr. Wessler and Dr. Abdul Min'am. I think perception matters in relations, and in international relations, perceptions sometimes are as important as realities on the ground. And the perception that is thinking in this side of the world is that America no longer considers the Gulf, the Arab Gulf region as vital of an interest as it used to be during the 20th century because of oil and because so many things. The perception also thinking over here is that the Middle East, the entire Middle East is becoming somewhat of a burden for American engagement as opposed to when it was a region of an asset to America. So these are coming out of Washington, statements, studies, etc., and we just have to react to them. And the way we have been reacting to them is that, okay, let's assume in the long run, short run, whatever run, 5 years down the road, that there will be less, 5%, let's say, less of America in the Gulf or in the region. So if that is the case, we really have to prepare ourselves for it. So there is a great deal of thinking over here. How do we take this perception, this narrative, this thing that we're hearing that's coming from Washington? How do we react, and what is the best policy that should Arab Gulf states and the Middle East region should deal with? And I think the scenario here is, let's assume that there is 5%, 10%, 20% less of America, not complete disengagement. This necessitate a lot of things. One of the things that we have already seen is that the Arab Gulf states have become more assertive, more bold, more independent in their thinking. And we have seen it in the past 5, 6, whatever years, the last 10 years, since the Arab Spring, by the way, in Yemen, in Bahrain, and other places. So that's one thing. The dynamics of the relationship is shifting on both sides. There is a new reality here in the Gulf, and there is a new reality in Washington, and we just have to adjust to it. That's just comment for Mr. Whistler's intervention.
Thank you, Dr. Abdul Khaliq. Mr. Whistler, what do you think of the peace process?
I think the general consensus in Washington, D.C. is that there is very low probability of a holistic, comprehensive solution to take place anytime soon. That will probably take a generational change, leadership changes on both sides of the equation. It will take political changes in both of the domestic political groupings. What can be done and what will be a big difference from the Trump administration are two things. Is one, to make sure that there are no steps taken that will prevent in the future a potential two-state solution. And to that extent, taking annexation off the table through the Abraham Accords was a very positive step. The second thing is that there'll be more attention to small steps that can be made, both in terms of confidence building and in terms of alleviating the suffering of the Palestinian people in certain regards. But I share my colleagues' views is that the circumstances don't appear likely for another attempt the way that President Clinton made for a holistic solution and failed, the way Condi Rice in the Bush administration made for a holistic solution and failed, the way John Kerry in the Obama administration spent a tremendous amount of time to try and failed, and even in a much different context, Jared Kushner tried and failed. And it's not likely that a fifth attempt will have a better outcome.
All right, thank you very much. The question now will go to Dr. Abdul Khaliq again. The Trump and Biden have different attitudes on regional crisis, especially in Yemen and Syria. And the Trump administration also was mainly content to play a supporting role in the peace efforts there. The exception was in Syria, where Trump sanctioned the regime through the Caesar bill in a bid to force it to engage in real political agreement. How will Biden respond to these crises? Will he pressure the various parties involved? If so, to what extent? Will he also consider sanctions on the use of arms deals as leverage?
Yemen, Syria, Iraq, Libya, there are so many of these issues, hotspots all over the place, and I'm not sure they are on the top 10 priorities of the Biden administration. And probably they would probably look at them and probably do a few things here and there, but I don't think they will come up with a comprehensive plan to put out all the fires that are rampaged in the region. Starting with Yemen, we have already done a whole lot to de-escalate in Yemen. Yemen is now, there is a war, there is a conflict, there is, something has to be attended to it. But I don't think things are much different today, 2021, than it was 3 years ago, 4 years ago, 5 years when this thing started. Okay? So I don't think the American would want to tangle too much and would leave it to Saudi Arabia and the Yemenis, Houthis, etc. And the United Nations role is important in Yemen. As for Syria, this is becoming like, a hopeless case for many actors, including the United States. I think everybody is happy and satisfied with things as they are. Assad in Damascus, Turkey in the north, Kurds are having their own autonomy with American support, and the Iranians are trying to infiltrate everything that there is. So it's also becoming a low priority in the list of things to be done. It's not as urgent as it used to be before, when Assad was going wild, murdering and massacring its people. But having said this, it's good also to know that this region is having two major problems at this moment, two destabilizing forces that are playing havoc with the region, one being Iran and what to do with that, and the second being Turkey and Erdogan and his aggrandized way of interfering in region. Both are hugely destabilizing actors, players in the region. So what Biden is going to do with them? Is he going to use, as you asked, maximum, again, the same sanction and more of the sanction against Turkey maybe? That is something that he already probably have said during the campaign. I don't know whether he's going to change his mind once he lands in the Oval Office. With Iran, I don't think there will be more of a sanction there, but maybe using the same sanction packages, and it's a huge, to maybe bring the Iranian back to the negotiating table. So yes, I think sanction is probably, there will not be more sanction, but unless, except for the case of Turkey, but I think Biden administration will be clever enough, wise enough to use the maximum sanction of the last 4 years to bring Iran to the table. If that is to happen, that's good news for us in the Gulf. We'll need less tension in the Gulf, not more tension in the Gulf. So probably that's the only good news that there is in all of this, Abdullah.
Thank you, Dr. Abdul Khaliq. And Dr. Abdul Nu'aim, what do you think?
I think, and I agree with Dr. Abdul Khaliq, that the situation in the region is full of a number of crises that we all know. However, I see that there is a kind of cooling to these crises in the past few years than it was 5 years ago, for instance. Yeah, I mean, now, and I believe that the regional moves is the one that's making the difference. With the exception, as I said, of the Iranian situation, because it has a nuclear factor, in which the United States, our big powers, got to get a stronger say, and that's Mr. Biden will do. But on Iraq, for instance, I think there is effort by the Emirates, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, to consolidate the new Iraqi leadership of Mr. Kazmi, and making Iraq is to come back into the equation in the region. There is an opening now in Libya with Turkey. I mean, Turkey now got the bite of being overextended in about 12 countries and spending money hitting Iraq, Syria, Libya, Somalia, Red Sea, and bases. I mean, now there is an opening between UAE and Turkey. There is a lot of kind of contracting its aggressiveness in Libya due to the position of the EU, particularly France and Germany, and also Egypt. And there was a game that was avoided to make clash with Egypt in Libya. In Libya now, there is production of oil, distribution of the oil money, movement of the Libyan central bank, an agreement about the framework of when to make elections, who will be president, I mean, there is a movement in the Libyan situation. Syria is still deconflicting, as you say. However, even deconflicting now is cornering the conflict in the northwest of the country, in Idlib in particular province, in which there is ISIS and there is Turkey and there is Russia and there is the Syrian central government. So we have a situation that's improving without the United States, except if there is a diplomatic move, exchange of intelligence work, and the attempt to avoid that Iran got too anxious in Syria to the degree to threaten Israel. Then we will have, I mean, a lot of clashes that take place mostly silently, but it's happening. So there is here a game that's related to Iran that's still very complex. But other than that, there is serious attempts and in many ways successes in the region because of the modalities of using diplomacy, connections, underneath kind of communications. The only probably still places is the Ethiopian dam issue. But now that's, with the internal domestic quarrels inside Ethiopia, things might, be on hold for a while. However, the most dangerous one that can turn into crisis is Iran. And other than that, I think support from the United States, diplomatic, economic moves, playing, third track kind of diplomacy, all kinds of, soft, not very hard power kind of involvement is on the table. And I don't think that Biden, according to what he said, is going to do more. Particularly with the internal front in the US is as hot as it is.
Thank you, Dr. Abdul Mun'im. Mr. Wester, what do you think of Biden's approach toward Syria, Libya, Yemen, and also, last thing, Erdogan?
I think a couple of things. First, there will be in general greater interest in U.S. diplomatic engagements. The folks that are coming in see America's role as always being engaged in such multilateral diplomatic efforts to wind down civil wars, to create ceasefires. That will be different than what we've seen in the Trump administration. And in general, I think, while I completely agree with my colleagues that at this moment, the region is going in a positive direction in terms of the regional crises that are happening. Many of these situations have gone through their initial military stages, which end up with a lot of violence, and have come to relative stability, or at least moving in that direction, despite all of the bloodshed and humanitarian crises that are happening. I think we all need to be a little modest and recognize how bad we've all been at predicting future crises in the region. I know, at least from the United States perspective, at least from my time in government, many big changes that took place, whether it was Saddam invading Kuwait, whether it was the rise of the Islamic State, whether it was the Arab Spring, and we can go on in the list, came as a surprise to many American policymakers. And given the inherent instability in many places in the Middle East, it wouldn't surprise me at all if President Biden finds himself, despite his desires, perhaps, disproportionately focused on the Middle East again because of events out of his control.
Thank you very much. At this end of this session, I would like to thank you all for your thoughtful insights. At the same time, we will move to the third and last session. It is titled "The Regional Threats and Strategies to Confront Them." Mr. Adil Sangur will be the moderator for this session. Thank you very much. We appreciate your time and your thoughts. Thank you very much.
Shukran, Abdullah. Thank you all.
Good evening, and thank you all for coming with us this evening. I am very delighted to moderate the third session today. This evening, we are pleased to welcome our third session panelist. First, Major General retired Amos Yadlin, very special guest from State of Israel. General Amos served for 40 years in the State of Israel as Israel Defense Forces. As well as 9 years of those 40 years, he was in the General Staff of IDF. General Amos is currently is the director of the Institute of National Security Studies. Israel is the leading think tank. Second is Dr. John B. Alterman. He's a senior vice president and the director of the Middle East program at CSIS. Dr. John is expert in the global security, geostrategy, and the U.S. policy toward the region. Third is Dr. Stephen A. Koch, as a senior fellow of the Eni Enrique Mati for the Middle East and the African Studies. Dr. Steve is the director of the international affairs, and he is expert on Arab-Turkish politics. Last but not least is Dr. Mohammed bin Huwaiden, is an associated professor of the international relations in the politics science program at the Department of Government and Society in the United Arab Emirates University. Dr. bin Huwaiden is the author of the book titled The Unholy Alliance, the United States of America and the Arabian Gulf. Dr. bin Huwaiden is expert on Iran foreign policy towards the Middle East. At this third session, our panelists will be sharing their expertise on regional threat and strategy to confront them. At the end of this session, we should be able to understand the future of U.S. foreign policy. Let me start first with the hot topic. As we all know, the Iranian issue is one of the most critical issues. The region and the entire world is watching closely to see how it's addressed by the new administrative. Biden has expressed the willingness to rejoin the nuclear deal if Iran complies with its term. He also spoken his intention to negotiate the surrounding issues of ballistic missiles and also Iran behavior in the region. Dr. bin Huwaiden, how can Biden balance his policy of re-engagement with the Iranian and the concern of its regional allies, such as the Arab and the Israelis as well, over the Iranian threat?
Thank you for inviting me to these discussions and share this panel with such wonderful people. I'm happy to be with all you all. I think there are many questions about this. We know that Mr. Biden is intent to revive the deal, but will he go back to the same nuclear deal with Iran, or will he negotiate a new deal? And so when exactly this will happen? Will there be involvement of new issues? Will there be involvement of new regional players? Will he apply a more secret approach to this issue, or will it be public? So we really do not have a complete answer for each of these questions. But we can, in general, analyze where things is likely to head to if President Biden really wants to re-engage with Iran over the nuclear program, as he indicated many times. He will need to accommodate the concern of the allies in the region by, I think, one, making sure that any deals must hold Iranian nuclear ambition for a very long time, or longer than the 15 years agreed upon by the previous deal. And two, making sure that any deal also should stop Iran proliferation of ballistic missiles that are capable of threatening regional stability. And three, also making sure that any deal must address also Iranian regional activities. Unfortunately, all US allies in the region are negatively affected by Iranian supports to violent non-state actors in the region. And four, getting the GCC involved in the renegotiated deal. I think this certainly help address the GCC concern about Iran nuclear proliferations. The good thing is that Mr. Biden has expressed his support to all this in his different remarks during his campaign. And I believe this is good things, because this is good for the GCC countries, and his allies will support this, because I think this is important because it will be addressing the concern of all parties involved in the region, and it will also prevent the region from any possible all-out war happening in the region. But the big question is, will Iran accept this? This is the big question. I think this all will depend on how Mr. Biden will present himself to the Iranian leadership. If he shows sign of weaknesses, Iran will take advantage. Will take advantage of that and reinforce its position. But if Biden shows some toughness, I think Iran may give in to the US demand. He can be tough by not showing that he is the one who really wants the deal. I think he should make the Iranian run after him for the deal, not him running the Iranian. How this can happen, I think there are certain things that Mr. Biden maybe can do, and this can reassure us in the region. One, he should not rush things. I think he should take his time. And now he is hampered with so many problems domestically. I think he should a little bit take his time on the issues of Iranian nuclear program. Second, he should gather international coalition, particularly with Europe, to pressure Iran to a new deal. Europe is more likely to support Biden in a more tougher deal with Iran. Iran needs to understand that this new deal, if it happens, it's not an American deal, it's an international demand for Iranian to come up with the international community. Third, continue pressuring and convincing China and Russia to support him on Iran in order to strengthen the process. Yes, it will be tough, but I think it is possible because after all, Russia and China do not want to see Iran having a nuclear bomb. And I think also Mr. Biden should not restrain Israel from showing some kind of toughness and threatening Iran to take a unilateral action against its nuclear facility. I think this is important because this makes Iran continuously worried. Five, not to weaken his relationship with its regional allies like the GCC and Israel, because that sends wrong messages to Iran about the state of the U.S. allies system in the region. This system has managed to overcome many obstacles throughout the 75 years of existence. And finally, Iran concern should also be addressed. You don't expect that Iran will give in without getting something in return. I think with all this kind of measures, Iran will come to the table. After all, Iran was willing actually to come and consider a new deal with Trump. But because of the U.S. election, it opted to wait until after the election.
Very well, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Benoued. And I think you summarized the Gulf view on those subjects. Let me pitch on with Dr. John. If you want to have another opinion, please.
First, this morning's news or this afternoon's news in your case is that Mr. Biden's nominated Bill Burns to be the head of the CIA. Of course, Jake Sullivan as the National Security Advisor. You have two people who are intimately involved in the secret approach to the Iranians in the Obama administration are in very senior roles in the Biden administration. I think the logic which they applied in the early stages, which is you give the Iranians a hard choice. You don't run after them. You don't coddle them. You give them a very hard choice, and you give them a gate to go through if they want to be easy and a gate to go through if they want to be hard. And I think that logic is going to be there. The key challenge they have in the near term, there's a lot of talk of freeze for freeze to try to get things started. But I think the Iranian presidential politics, and as Dr. Mohammed very correctly said, you can't run after the Iranians because they'll take advantage. I think we're going to have very minimal progress in the first several months. And then after the Iranian election, we may have something. I think there's a hard choice ahead for U.S. allies in the region who are concerned about any approach to Iran, to not have their concerns about Iran ruin or spoil or make more difficult the U.S. relationship. I think this is going to be a strategic priority, and unilateral Israeli step, unilateral Gulf step, I think would create tensions with the Biden administration. The Biden administration, and Jake Sullivan's been very clear about this for more than a year, to bring allies in, to have regional security discussions. It's all a priority, but the general determination, the premise that there can be an agreement with Iran and we're better off with Iran inside an agreement rather than Iran outside any agreement is going to be the way the Biden administration is going to try to go, give them a hard choice to make and move them in a better direction. I don't know whether you're going to have an Iranian government that's willing to make a comprehensive deal after the last deal was torn up by the Trump administration. But the premise of the Biden administration will be we're better off with Iran in agreements rather than outside agreements. And I think Israel and the Gulf states are going to have to make a fundamental choice to go along with that approach.
Very well, thank you very much. I think before I bring the General Amos Yaldin to pitch in this discussion, let me also bring up another subject that is also applicable. It is very well known that there is a consensus within the Israeli over the risk posed by the Iranian nuclear program. However, it seems to be there are two different opinions in these issues. The first leans towards the engagement with the new U.S. administration and forcing it, deeply weighing the Iranian nuclear threat. The second viewpoint is favor the need to cooperate with the new administration. So General Amos, also taking this question in your mind, and feel free to pitch in with the previous question as well. In your opinion, how will Israel respond to the reality, and what would be Israel's position if the U.S. administration decided to rejoin the nuclear deal before taking the Iranian ballistic missile or the Iranian behavior?
Yeah, as John indicated, the players in the new Biden administrations are all belong to the past 2013-2015 agreement with Iran that ended up as the JCPOA. The opinion in Israel is that the JCPOA is a problematic agreement. The differences are between those who think that it's a very bad agreement, like the Prime Minister, and those who are saying it's problematic. Let's correct the loopholes in the old agreement. And the big question is not whether to go back to an agreement with Iran, but what kind of agreement with Iran. And we see in the new Biden administration two approaches. Those who want immediately to go back to complying with the old agreement, and in Israel we think that this is a huge mistake, or those who understand that the assumptions that the old agreement, the 2015 agreement, were based on, were found in the last couple of years as a very weak assumptions. The assumption that Iran will behave differently in the region was found wrong. The assumption that the reformists will get more power politically in Iran was found wrong. The assumption that money that they will get will use for the benefit of the people and not for more arming and buying weapons was found wrong. And the basis to the agreement, the approval of the IAEA that Iran military dimension of the program is okay, was found wrong. So we basically think in Israel that if the Biden administration is up to engage with Iran, they have to do it on a different basis, on repairing all the loopholes of the inspection, which is not everywhere, every time, the loophole of the weapon military dimension, the sunset that is coming too soon, and Iran haven't got the trust of the international community to get a full legitimacy to their nuclear program. It was mentioned that Bill Burns was announced today to be the head of the CIA. I read another important piece of information that Henry Kissinger, the very experienced, smart statesman, have said that going to the old JCPOA is a recipe for a cascade of nuclear programs in the Middle East. And what Iran was granted, the rest of the countries will go for it. And this is a real nightmare of no proliferation, nuclear non-proliferation in the Middle East. When you ask about the ideas in Israel or the position of Israel, you have to differentiate between the Prime Minister, who represent the most extreme position, against the deal, against going back to the deal, the way he did it in the past, in 2013, 2015. And the question is whether he will engage or, as you ask, cooperate. I think he may not engage and not cooperate. He may have a very strong position that wasting the leverages that President Trump have created and give in to the Iranians in the beginning of the negotiation, you will not have any leverage to change and to improve the deal. Because it's not whether to go to the deal or not go to the deal. It's whether you're having a good deal or a problematic deal. Another issue, and I will end up with that, is whether to go only on nuclear issue or to expand it to the whole Millennium behavior of Iran in the region and the ballistic missiles and what they are doing in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, everywhere. I think the Prime Minister will ask for a comprehensive deal because he knows that this will never work. My position, by the way, take the nuclear issue to a new agreement, a better agreement that will really stop all the streets for Iran to a nuclear bomb. On the other issue, you just have to deal with it in a different area, because in a different ways that the Iranians will not get any concession because of the nuclear deal. What the Obama administration have done, they wanted so much to keep the nuclear deal alive, they haven't dealt with any other Millennium behavior of Iran. So nuclear deal only, fine. But we will fight with you on all the other issues strongly and aggressively.
Thank you very much for your insight, General Ramos. Before I address this question to Dr. Steve, let me give you a quick narrative about the issues. One of the third issues that is in the table now is U.S.-Turkish relationship. It has been significantly in tension at the recent year. The most important point of the contention between U.S. and the Turkish is the S-300 deal, for which the sanctions were imposed under the CAATSA Act deal. Dr. Steve, do you think that Biden will impose more sanction on Ankara, or he will keep the limit to the sanction enforced by President Trump as the beginning of a new relationship? And also, what Biden's position on Turkey's regional policy, especially the eastern of the Mediterranean?
Important ones, and I think that the U.S.-Turkish relationship is one of the more critical ones that the Biden administration is going to have to deal with in the relatively early going, despite a long and exhaustive domestic political agenda for the new administration. But before I address the U.S.-Turkey relationship, I just want to address the conversation that John, Mohammed, and Amos were talking about, and just kind of at a level of abstraction, if you take everything that they said, it speaks to the monumental task ahead of the Biden administration when it re-engages with Iran. Because what it requires is for them to, as we say here in the United States, fit a square peg into a round hole. Even those who are aligned and somewhat skeptical about a new agreement or re-entering the JCPOA have differences in terms of what their emphases want to be. So it strikes me that one of the things that I think that the Washington foreign policy community hasn't really given enough thought to is how moving back into a negotiation, whether it's reviving the JCPOA from 2015 or a JCPOA 2.0, one, how that also splits regional partners of the United States and potentially radicalizes the region. You can talk about including missiles and Iran's regional behavior or a better nuclear deal. These aren't necessarily things that the Iranians are going to be willing to give up, nor are they things that America's regional partners are going to want to be particularly flexible on. So I'm not sure that a new agreement is going to be the answer to this. I, for one, am on record for saying that it's an unlikely event, and that we should think more carefully about how best to contain Iran, both in the Gulf and around the region, which would probably we'd get more return on our investment for that. Anyway, my 2 cents on the Iran issue. On the U.S.-Turkey relationship, clearly the S-400 is the centerpiece of problems, but there is a long list of issues that divide the United States and Ankara. I think that the Turks believe that if they say reset long enough, if they posture as wanting to be more flexible going forward with the new administration, that they will, in fact, be let out of the box. I think that that's an unlikely thing for 2 reasons. One, President-elect Joe Biden is an institutionalist, and I think that he has a real compelling domestic political urgency in reestablishing the balances between the branches of government. And when it comes to the S-400, the Senate has been very, very clear that as long as the Turks have purchased the S-400, the President of the United States should apply sanctions on Turkey. I don't see any reason why President-elect Biden, once he enters the Oval Office, will see fit to suspend those sanctions for any reasons. The Turks will have to comply in some way, crate up the S-400s, do something, but they cannot keep the S-400s and escape the sanctions that the current administration has already applied. When it comes to a broader range of issues, I think that it's clear that across the political spectrum in the United States, that Turkey's aggressive approach to the Eastern Mediterranean, its aggressive approach in other parts of the region, whether Libya, which is now connected to the Eastern Mediterranean, whether it is in the region itself, the kind of angry and ugly rhetoric with regard to Israel and its conflict with the Palestinians, these kinds of things, added to the profound repression in Turkey's domestic politics, would suggest that there is going to be a change. The idea that Turkey can be a bulwark against Russia or Iran, I think, is something that people say, but the evidence suggests otherwise. So what I'm expecting is that there's going to be a very tough period between the United States and Turkey, unlike President Trump and President Erdogan, unlike President Obama and President Erdogan, at least during the first Obama administration. There aren't warm feelings between Biden and Erdogan. So at least at that level, where Joe Biden has an advantage given his long history and the way in which he relates to leaders around the world, there's a certain frostiness between the two countries. So I suspect that the Biden folks will be waiting for Turkey to perform and change its behavior in a variety of areas before taking any positive steps in the direction of Ankara. And Ankara just saying that it wants a reset, that it wants a committee to study the disposition of the S-400s is just not going to cut it.
Thank you, Dr. Steve. So, Dr. John, do you have an addition or do you have a different view on this Turkish-US relationship?
I mean, not only do I think Stephen has captured it well, I think we would do well to think more about security in the Eastern Mediterranean, about Turkey's efforts to restructure the Eastern Mediterranean in a way in which it has more power, and the rising alliance between Israel and other countries, including Greece, to try to constrain Turkey. It strikes me that the Eastern Mediterranean is an area of significant instability is the wrong word, significant contestation that the Biden administration will have to devote more time to. And I totally agree with Stephen that the assumption that that Turkey is a bulwark and is a NATO ally is essential to everything we think about security in the Eastern Mediterranean. Turkey is a question mark, and the S-400 deal underlines the fact that Turkey is a question mark and not a bulwark.
Thanks, John, for I think the best way to capture it is that Turkey may be a NATO ally, but it's certainly not a partner. And it clearly believes that an American-led order in the region and with its allies is not in Turkey's best interests. And it has worked assiduously to undermine that order.
Very well said. Thank you. And let me bring you to the positive development here in the region. In the past few days, we have seen a major move towards the resolution of the Gulf crisis, with the signs of potential Turkish Gulf reapproachment. So, Dr. Ben Huwaiden, I want you to start the discussion. What the impact will these developments have on the existing crisis in the wide region? And specifically, do you believe that an end to the Gulf crisis could lead to potential settlement and dispute elsewhere in the region? Dr. Ben Huwaiden.
Okay, thank you. Just let me go back to the 2 points that raised here by my colleagues. One about the regional activities, and me as academician, I cannot escape my academic argument here. In terms of Iranian regional activities, I think there are 2 ways here in dealing with these issues. One, by using hard power to contain and eliminating Iran presence and influence in the region. And this strategy has been used for some time now, but it seems like it's not working well for different reasons. Iran is still acting aggressively in different parts of the region. Therefore, the other way, I think, is by looking from a different angle to these issues. And I think it is time to work toward making a deal with Iran, a deal that involves all major powers in the region, including Israel and the GCC countries and everybody else, and a deal that make us move beyond the balance of power, because the balance of power is the one that making us all actually in this trouble nowadays, because we cannot go beyond balance of power. We stick in this box of called the balance of power, and we move in this kind of rivalry that is actually will one day, and it did actually make us reach the tipping points of getting involved in a direct war or indirect war with Iran. So we should go beyond balance of power to address what is called balance of security. That can, I think it will, balance of security will address the concern of everybody in the region. And it will be good for everybody. Balance of power require competition. It's a zero-sum game. While balance of security require more collaborations, and everybody will collaborate, and maybe that can achieve a better solutions to everybody. Iran consider itself regional activity, consider its regional activities as part of the balance of power and strategy in the region to dominate the region. So moving beyond this, I think, is the only way, in my opinion, to control Iran and to contain its continuous efforts to meddle in the internal affairs of the regions. And in regard to the Turkey issues, I do agree with both Dr. Stephen and Dr. John on this. But I think the most important elements here is really the European factor. Because Europe is not happy with Turkey policy, particularly in the issues of the water dispute in the Mediterranean. Biden is coming to recharge U.S. ties with its allies in Europe. I think he will go along with what Europe thinks about Turkey, and this, I think, will not head in Turkey favor. In regard to your questions about the
positive development of the Gulf and the Gulf region.
Yes, and this is too early to really to argue about, because it really has not been shaped completely yet. Is this reconciliation? It's really a complete one? Is it a real one? Is it will lead to informing the normalizations of relations and with the countries of the GCC, all them together? This is not clear yet, because the big issues are still there and are not solved yet. And many countries of the region, some countries of the regions are still they are in the process of creating some kind of trust between them, but it will take a long time.
Thank you, Dr. Ben. Dr. John, I would like to get your view on this. How do you see it from your perspective? How do you see this positive development in the Gulf?
I frankly see it as a hudna. It is an end of the aggression, but it's not a peace. It's not a full agreement. And I agree with Dr. Mohammed that how it plays out is unclear. I certainly don't think that either side had been getting what it wanted from the continued tension. So perhaps finding a way to create negotiations might help each side get more of what it wants, and that's a positive opportunity.
Thank you very much for your addition. The last subject is the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood is a source of concern for the countries in the region. It has been included in the terrorist list in the number of the countries. There also have been calls for the American official to designate the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist group. Let me start with you, Dr. John. In your opinion, how will Biden deal with this issue, and will this administration draw closer to the Muslim Brotherhood as was the case during the Obama era, or will it adopt a different approach?
So frankly, I disagree with the premise of your question that the Obama administration drew closer to the Muslim Brotherhood. Let me start off by saying I think the Muslim Brotherhood is so much weaker, has so much less support, that this is a much less urgent issue than it might otherwise have been. But I think the Obama strategy, which I think will very much be the Biden strategy, is one focused on processes and not outcomes. That one of the real problems the Obama administration had is persuading people in the region that it's the process that matters, and process can take care of bad outcomes, but you need to let the process play out. And the region's insistence, and by the region, I include a number of Israelis I spoke to, said, no, you can't trust a process. You can't trust a population to rein itself in. You have to have an authoritarian government that makes choices for people, that keep people from making wrong decisions. I think what you're going to see in the Biden administration, from everything I've seen, the people who've been named as senior officials saying, is we have to have some confidence in creating a process. We have to have some sense of responsibility. We have to get rid of what's called I forget what it's called, where people feel freed because they don't have to deal with the consequences of bad choices. And there's this sense that allows people to be more reckless.
Yeah.
And I think you're going to see an emphasis on democratization as a broad thing, as opening societies, as allowing more thought, keeping it within boundaries. The Brotherhood, I think, has ceased to be a major factor in that, because the Brotherhood has thoroughly discredited itself from what it did in power. But the general sense of priority of having societies that become more resilient by opening them up, I think is going to be a theme of the Biden administration. I think the other piece of this, which is worth thinking about, and through all the discussions today, I've been struck at how little discussion there's been of China. But I think the China model is that you can use total information awareness and surveillance of your population, and you can control populations politically and socially, and you can have economic advancement. I think that is going to run very much against the administration's instinct. And there are going to be times when governments are going to have to choose between a more Chinese approach and a more American approach, and there'll be consequences for making different choices.
Thank you. I think I would ask General Amos to weigh in this subject, the Muslim Brotherhood. As we all know, probably the Israel is also having issues with the Muslim Brotherhood through Hamas, the associated Muslim Brotherhood. What's your opinion on this subject, General Amos?
I think, unlike Iran, they are not committed in the Biden administration to the policy that Obama took early in his first term vis-a-vis the Muslim Brotherhood. They have learned the lesson. Egypt, Libya, and the two questions that we discussed this afternoon, Turkey and Qatar, and you mentioned Hamas. So the Muslim Brotherhood is not what seems to be a decade ago, like the solution to the Arab world to move for democratization. They are not as naive as that. Yes, they will emphasize human rights vis-a-vis the Egyptian regime, vis-a-vis some other countries, but I don't see the Biden administration actively supporting Muslim Brotherhood anywhere. It seems like, once again, democratization, yes, human rights, yes, but changing maybe in the margin the behavior of the current regimes, but don't bring a Muslim Brotherhood regime as a regime change. This is not going to happen. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Steve, do you have any other point of view on this subject? Stephen?
Well, I think just to add a few thoughts. One, I think that the question that Amos brought up about Turkey is one that is, I think, an important one, given the ideological nature, in part, of Turkey's posture in the region. The kind of theoretical and intellectual constructs of the Justice and Development Party's view of the world puts one Turkey at the leadership of the Muslim world and in concert with Islamist groups, which they think are the wave of the future, like themselves, and the belief that certain institutions of the state are just not relevant within the ummah. So that's one issue. But when it comes to U.S. foreign policy, it strikes me that whether the United States designates the Muslim Brotherhood or not is not going to make a tremendous amount of change either within the region or within the United States. And it might not necessarily be something that is a real priority for the Biden administration. But I certainly agree that this is not where the United States or the foreign policy community was in 2011 and 2012, where there were endless numbers of invitations hosting Muslim Brotherhood delegations in Washington, and certain irresponsible people falling all over themselves to ingratiate themselves with the Brotherhood. I will say, though, that it will be part of the debate, if only because the Brotherhood, I think, recognizing that it is a force that has been discredited, has now, it's whether at an individual level or a collective level, has transformed themselves into human rights activists and democracy activists. And I think that there is an inclination, a tendency among groups within Washington to see them as human rights activists rather than getting the fuller picture of what happened. And then finally, I think John is right. There is going to be a decision point at some time in the future about democratization and what model countries in the region want to follow. Where I diverge slightly from John is I'm not sure what the consequences will be if countries decide to pursue the China model. I tend to see the China model as something that's unique to China. But if countries want to pursue that, I'm not sure what consequences, where the United States is going to bring consequences to bear and to what end.
Thank you very much, Dr. Stephen. Dr. Ben Huwaiden, do you want to have the Gulf view on this subject, the Muslim Brotherhood?
Yes, I just on 2 points here. One about the Muslim Brotherhood. Let me say that Biden, I don't think Biden will draw closer to Muslim Brotherhood for two reasons. One is that the circumstances and the situations in the Middle East nowadays are different from that of Obama time in the sense that during that time there were popular uprisings with what's so-called the Arab Spring. Obama then adjusted his position to support Muslim Brotherhood because they were the main popular forces that can lead Egypt at that time, according to his understanding. Today, Muslim Brotherhood are dismantled, weakened in the Arab world, and they do not control any major Arab countries. The second reason is that the Muslim Brotherhoods are classified as terrorist groups in many Arab countries. So Mr. Biden will be very careful not to support such groups in order not to annoy some of his allies in the region. The other issue here about Mr. Biden applying a tougher stance against maybe Egypt, against Saudi Arabia on the issues of democracy and human rights. By looking at Americans' foreign policy throughout the 75 years of relations with the Arab world and the GCC, the Gulf countries in particular, I believe that Mr. Biden will be a more pragmatic, just like Obama did in most of his 2 terms in dealing with the region. Despite his short-lived somehow political support to Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, Mr. Biden will come to understand that he cannot bring settlement to Yemen without having Saudi support. He cannot rebuild Yemen without Saudi support. He cannot win over Al-Qaeda or ISIS in the Arabian Peninsula without Saudi support. And he cannot reach peace and security with Iran without Saudi support. So I think, and I think Mr. Biden is wise enough not to undermine U.S. interest in the region. And I can even argue further to say that the U.S. to some extent will not be able to fight China global rise or Russia regional influence or Turkey efforts without Saudi and some major regional countries support as well. So Saudi Arabia, Egypt, the UAE, and some other countries in the region will continue to matter to the U.S. under Mr. Biden administration, in my opinion, for the reason that Mr. Biden will need the major countries for achieving some successful steps in the Middle East, because he is stuck in a very bad situation domestically, and he need to get some successful stories somewhere.
Very well said. I think in that note, General Ramos and Dr. Steve, Dr. John, Dr. Muhammad, I am compelled to thank you very much for your contribution and for your insight. Ladies and gentlemen, as the U.S. President-elect Joe Biden takes office in the matter of week, it is clear he faces a series of unprecedented challenges as well as the opportunities. The experts' analysis we hear today has shed a light on key issues. At the end of this extremely insightful and productive discussion, and on behalf of His Excellency, Dr. Sultan Mohammed Al-Nuaimi, the Director General of the ECSR, I would like to thank all of our guests for their valuable insight, as well as you, the esteemed viewer. We look forward to welcome you to our new event. Thank you very much.